He had waited months for this moment. Every late-night conversation, every promise, every "I miss you" had led him here. A Nigerian man, crossing borders for love, stepping into a foreign land with nothing but excitement in his heart. But excitement can be blinding, and love? Love can be the deadliest illusion of all. The heartbeat stops. The screen flashes, an abandoned suitcase on the side of a road, a blood-stained floor, a door left slightly ajar. What he thought was the beginning of a beautiful future, was really the first step toward a fate he never could have imagined. Welcome to Crime Quarter, the place where true crime stories unfold with every twist darker than the last. If you crave stories that grip you, haunt you, and stay with you long after the screen fades to black, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because in the world of crime, the scariest stories are the ones that actually happened. Meet 27-year-old Andrew, a young Nigerian man with dreams of love and a heart full of hope. Like many in this digital age, he turned to the internet to find companionship, a connection beyond borders. That's where he met Abina, a beautiful Ghanaian woman who seemed to be everything he had ever wanted. She was kind, affectionate, and always knew the right words to say. She listened when he spoke, comforted him when he was down, and over time, she became more than just a name on a screen. She became his dream, his future. Or so he thought. The romantic music begins to distort, a slight dissonance creeping in. For months, they built something that felt real. Long nights of deep conversations, whispered promises of forever, and an unshakable belief that this was destiny. But love, especially the kind that exists only behind a screen, is a fragile thing. What Andrew didn't realize was that behind the soft words and affectionate gestures, something far more dangerous was waiting. Something that had been planned from the very beginning. Have you ever met someone online and felt like you knew them, even without ever seeing them in person? Have you ever wondered if the person behind the screen was really who they claimed to be? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes, love is not what it seems. Andrew had always believed in love, the kind of love that defied distance, the kind that made long nights feel shorter and turned strangers into soulmates. For months, he had been caught up in an intoxicating whirlwind of romance with Abina, a woman he had met online who seemed to embody everything he had ever dreamed of. She was beautiful, intelligent, affectionate, and, most importantly, she made him feel seen. Their conversations stretched for hours into the night, filled with sweet words, deep confessions, and promises of a future together. She spoke about her longing to meet him, about how she dreamed of the day they would finally be in each other's arms. Andrew, eager and hopelessly in love, had decided to take the leap. He would travel from Lagos to Ghana, to meet the woman who had stolen his heart. It was a bold decision, perhaps even reckless, but love had a way of making people throw caution to the wind. With his bags packed and his heart racing with anticipation, he boarded the bus that would take him on the long journey to Accra. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the steady movement of the road beneath him did little to calm the growing excitement in his chest. He imagined the moment he would finally set eyes on Abina, the warmth in her smile, the way she would look at him with love shining in her eyes. He pictured them walking along the bustling streets of Accra, eating at local restaurants, laughing at inside jokes, and creating memories that would last a lifetime. Every mile that passed brought him closer to that reality, and he could hardly wait. But even in the midst of his excitement, a strange, nagging feeling lurked beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't doubt, not exactly, but a vague uneasiness that whispered at the edges of his mind. He brushed it aside, telling himself that it was only nerves. After all, meeting someone in real life after months of online communication was bound to come with some level of anxiety. He shook off the thought and focused on the messages Abina had sent him earlier that day, sweet words, affectionate emojis, and, most importantly, the address where they were supposed to meet. "I can't wait to see you, my love. Safe journey. I'll be waiting," her last message read. When he finally arrived in Ghana, exhausted but eager, he wasted no time. The first thing he did was pull out his phone and send her a message, "Just got here. Can't wait to see you." He waited, watching the screen for those 3 little dots that would indicate she was typing. Nothing. He frowned slightly but didn't panic. Maybe she was busy, maybe she hadn't seen the message yet. He sent another. Still nothing. His fingers hovered over the call button before he finally pressed it. The line rang once, then twice, then cut off. He tried again. This time, the call didn't go through at all. A strange chill crept up his spine. He checked the last messages they had exchanged, rereading them as if searching for some hidden clue. She had been so excited for his arrival, why would she go silent now? His gut twisted, but he forced himself to stay calm. It was probably just network issues. He was in a new country, after all. Determined not to let paranoia ruin his trip, he took a deep breath, grabbed his suitcase, and hailed a cab. He had come too far to turn back now. As the taxi pulled away from the city center, the streets became quieter, the houses more spread apart. The once busy roads grew narrower, winding through less familiar neighborhoods. The driver, an older man with a weary face, glanced at Andrew through the rearview mirror. "You sure this is the place?" he asked, his tone neutral but edged with something that sounded almost like concern. Andrew hesitated for a brief second before nodding. "Yes, that's the address she gave me," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Minutes later, the car slowed to a stop in front of a house that was nothing like what Andrew had envisioned. Instead of a welcoming home, he was met with a sight that sent a cold wave of uncertainty washing over him. The building was old and worn down, its walls cracked, its windows dark and lifeless. The metal gate in front hung loosely, swaying slightly in the wind, creaking as if whispering a warning he couldn't quite understand. A single dim light flickered above the front porch, casting eerie shadows that stretched across the ground. The entire area was unnervingly silent, too silent. Andrew swallowed hard. This didn't feel right. He pulled out his phone and tried calling Abina one more time. No response. His heart pounded harder now, his palms damp with sweat. He turned to the driver, considering asking him to wait, but something held him back. Maybe he was just overreacting. Maybe she was inside, waiting, unaware of the messages she had missed. Maybe, just maybe, this was all in his head. Determined not to let doubt ruin what could be the best moment of his life, he stepped out of the cab, slung his bag over his shoulder, and walked toward the gate. As he pushed it open, the rusted hinges groaned in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the eerie quiet. He hesitated again, glancing around. The air was thick with something he couldn't name, something invisible yet suffocating. He took a deep breath and forced himself forward, one slow step at a time. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. Movement. Not from the house, but from the shadows beyond it, something shifting between the trees, watching. His breath caught in his throat. His fingers tightened around his phone. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to turn around, to leave, to run. And yet, his feet remained planted where they were, frozen between the fear clawing at his chest and the hope that, somehow, this was all just his imagination playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew. Something was very, very wrong. And he was standing right in the middle of it. As Andrew stood at the threshold of the strange, decaying house, every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn around, to walk away, to run as fast as he could. The eerie silence that filled the air, the flickering light above the door casting unsettling shadows, and the sheer darkness inside the house all sent an undeniable message: something was terribly wrong. Yet, despite the unease crawling up his spine, he forced himself to move forward, convincing himself that fear was irrational. He had come too far, risked too much, and let himself believe in this moment for too long to give in now. The thought of Abina, the woman who had filled his days with warmth and affection through endless late-night conversations, overpowered the growing dread gnawing at him. He had longed for this moment for months, and now that he was finally here, he couldn't let doubt cloud his judgment. Slowly, he pushed the door open, the old hinges groaning under the weight of years of neglect, the sound unnervingly loud against the oppressive silence. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying a strange metallic scent that sent an involuntary shiver down his spine. Dust swirled in the dim light, disturbed by his cautious steps as he moved forward. The house was barely furnished. An old wooden table stood in the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs, while a tattered couch sat against the far wall, its fabric torn open like the gaping wound of something long forgotten. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the corners, clinging to the edges of the room like unseen specters watching his every move. Then he saw it. A phone. Sitting on the table. Vibrating. Andrew froze, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at the device, confusion knitting his brows together. Something about it seemed eerily familiar, an odd sense of recognition creeping into his thoughts. Taking a hesitant step forward, his heart began to pound harder against his ribcage, a strange unease settling deep in his gut. As he reached out and lifted the phone, his blood ran cold. It wasn't just any phone, it was identical to his. Same model, same slight crack along the side, the same worn-out buttons that had once frustrated him. His own phone was still in his pocket, yet here it was, vibrating in his trembling hands. The screen was lit, a series of messages displayed before him. His messages. The same ones he had sent to Abina over the last few days. Each one had been opened, read, but never answered. A slow, creeping horror spread through his veins as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. If this phone was here, then who had been replying to him all this time? How had they known exactly what to say to make him trust them? His breathing grew uneven, his pulse racing with a panic he could no longer suppress. Then, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, like the weight of the room had changed, pressing down on him. A faint sound reached his ears, so soft he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. A whisper of movement. A breath in the darkness behind him. Then another sound. The unmistakable creak of a floorboard. Andrew's entire body went rigid as a wave of dread slammed into him. He wasn't alone. Swallowing hard, he turned his head slightly, scanning the room without making any sudden movements. The shadows seemed to pulse, shifting ever so slightly, as though something unseen lurked within them. His instinct screamed at him to run, to escape before it was too late, but before he could act, another sound sent his terror into overdrive. A step. Closer this time. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps as his body screamed at him to move, to fight, to do something, anything, but he was frozen in place, paralyzed by the overwhelming realization that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Then, without warning, the door behind him slammed shut with a force that shook the entire room. The deafening bang sent a jolt through his body, his muscles tightening as adrenaline flooded his system. His hand shot out instinctively, reaching for the doorknob, but before he could grasp it, a new movement caught his eye. Shadows. Emerging from the darkness. Figures, tall, silent, their features obscured by the dim light, stepped forward with a slow, deliberate motion. Their presence was suffocating, their silence even more terrifying than words could ever be. There were 3 of them, maybe more, their bodies blending into the dark like phantoms rising from the abyss. They did not speak, did not make a sound, did not hesitate. Then, in a single, fluid motion, they lunged. A sharp pain exploded at the back of Andrew's head, a searing white-hot agony that sent his world spinning. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the flickering light above him, pulsing like a dying heartbeat in the suffocating darkness. When consciousness returned, it did so in jagged, fragmented pieces. Pain. A deep, throbbing ache at the base of his skull. His limbs, heavy, restrained. A cold, rough sensation digging into his wrists. His breath came in ragged, uneven gasps as his mind struggled to claw its way back to awareness. He forced his eyes open. The room was different now. Smaller. Darker. The only light came from a dim, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting erratic shadows against the walls. The scent of damp wood and something metallic filled his nostrils. Panic surged through his chest as he tried to move, only to realize with horrifying clarity that he couldn't. His arms wouldn't budge. His legs, immobile. He was tied to a chair. His heart pounded violently as he strained against his restraints, his breath quickening into desperate gasps. The rope bit into his skin, tight and unyielding, his efforts doing nothing but sending fresh waves of pain through his limbs. Then he heard it. A sound. Soft. Deliberate. Just beyond the edge of the light. He wasn't alone. Andrew's pulse spiked as his eyes darted around the room, his vision adjusting to the dim glow. Shadows shifted just out of reach, too fluid, too unnatural to be a trick of the light. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to demand, to scream, but before a single word could escape, something moved. A figure stepped forward. Then another. And another. The realization crashed into him like a tidal wave, suffocating and absolute. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a trap. And he had walked right into it. The investigation into Andrew's tragic and horrifying death sent shockwaves through both local and international communities. His case was more than just another crime, it was a chilling mystery that left both authorities and the public searching for answers. The sheer brutality of his murder, combined with the eerie and cryptic message left on his body, raised countless questions. Who was behind this? Was it personal, or was he just another victim in a much larger, more sinister scheme? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was the person responsible still out there, waiting for their next target? Determined to uncover the truth, law enforcement agencies in both Ghana and Nigeria launched an intense investigation. Crime scene investigators meticulously combed through every inch of the abandoned house where Andrew had been found. The walls were bare, the rooms empty, and apart from the broken furniture and dusty floors, there was nothing to suggest that anyone had actually lived there. There were no personal belongings, no photographs, no signs of everyday life, just a place that seemed to exist solely for one purpose, to lure Andrew in and end his life in a calculated and brutal manner. The house itself became an unsettling piece of the puzzle. Who owned it? Had it been used for similar crimes before? If so, how many others had stepped through that very same door, never to leave again? Investigators soon turned their attention to the one person who had lured Andrew to Ghana in the first place, Abina. She was the key to everything. If they could find her, they could find answers. They combed through databases, traced phone numbers, and analyzed digital footprints, trying to find even the smallest lead that could bring them closer to the person Andrew had believed was his soulmate. But as they dug deeper, what they uncovered was even more disturbing than they had imagined. Abina didn't exist. The phone number Andrew had been messaging and calling so affectionately was registered under a fake identity. The social media account that had once been so active, filled with carefully crafted messages, voice notes, and affectionate exchanges, had completely disappeared. Vanished without a trace. Every single picture Abina had sent to Andrew, every smile, every moment that had convinced him she was real, had been stolen from an unsuspecting woman in another country. Abina was nothing more than an elaborate illusion, a mask worn by someone lurking in the shadows. But if she wasn't real, then who had been behind the messages? Who had planned this entire deception with such chilling precision? As authorities scrambled to answer these questions, they stumbled upon an even more horrifying revelation. Andrew wasn't the first victim. Over the past 2 years, at least 5 men, each from different parts of West Africa, had gone missing under strikingly similar circumstances. Like Andrew, they had formed online relationships with women who seemed perfect. Women who made them feel special, loved, wanted. Each of these men had eagerly packed their bags, booked their tickets, and traveled to Ghana in the hopes of beginning a new chapter of their lives. But none of them had returned home. Some were never seen again. Others were found under chillingly mysterious circumstances, their bodies left in places that made investigators question whether they had been chosen at random, or if there was something far more calculated at play. The deeper authorities dug, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary case of online deception. This was something much more sinister. Was it the work of a serial killer, someone who took pleasure in luring victims in with false promises before ending their lives in a brutal fashion? Or was this a highly organized syndicate, using love as a weapon to trap and eliminate their targets? And if this was indeed an organized group, what was their motive? Money? Revenge? Or something even darker? Each of the victims had been young men, men looking for love and connection. Could this have been a targeted operation, preying specifically on those who were vulnerable to romantic manipulation? As authorities desperately searched for answers, one thing became clear: whoever was behind this had mastered the art of deception and erasure. They had built an intricate web of lies, and anyone who got too close to the truth simply disappeared. And yet, there was one final question, one detail that haunted investigators more than anything else. Why was Andrew chosen? Was he a random target, or had someone specifically picked him for this fate? And what did the message left on his body, "Wrong choice, Andrew," truly mean? Was it a warning? A taunt? Or the final, chilling signature of a predator who had already moved on to their next victim? As the investigation continued, the answers remained elusive. But one thing was certain: this was not over. Not by a long shot. For months, the investigation had seemed like an endless maze, with every lead either disappearing into thin air or leading to more unanswered questions. Andrew's death was no ordinary crime, it was methodical, chillingly precise, and wrapped in an enigma that made it seem as though the perpetrator had planned every move down to the smallest detail. But finally, after relentless work by authorities, a breakthrough came. A suspect was in custody. In the early hours of the morning, law enforcement officials stormed a small apartment on the outskirts of Accra, acting on a tip that had led them to a young woman named Linda. To outsiders, she was just another ordinary local woman, blending into the city's daily hustle. But behind closed doors, she had been hiding a terrifying secret. Linda was arrested on the spot, handcuffed as officers searched her apartment for evidence. But what they found inside was more horrifying than anyone had anticipated. The apartment was nothing short of a digital crime hub. Scattered across the room were dozens of SIM cards, each one linked to different phone numbers used to create fake identities. There were stacks of forged identification documents, passports, and handwritten notes containing personal details of men, names, ages, locations, even details about their families. The walls were covered in maps, travel routes carefully marked out. Printed screenshots of old conversations with victims were found, some with chilling annotations scribbled in red ink: "Too cautious, easy target, believes everything." These were not the actions of an amateur scammer looking for quick money. This was something far more insidious. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a small notebook tucked inside a drawer. Its pages were filled with names, some crossed out, others circled, as if they were next in line. Next to Andrew's name, one phrase stood out: "He was too easy." But even with all this overwhelming evidence, Linda refused to speak. She sat in the interrogation room, emotionless, as detectives fired question after question at her. Who else was involved? Why were these men being lured in? What did the message on Andrew's body mean? But she never answered. The authorities suspected she wasn't working alone. The scale of the operation was too large, too organized for one person to manage. But if Linda was just a pawn in a much bigger game, who was truly pulling the strings? As the case unraveled, a darker possibility emerged. Could this have been more than just an organized scam? Could there have been something deeper at play, something ritualistic, something no one had even considered? If Linda wasn't the mastermind, then the real person behind these deaths was still out there. Watching. Waiting. And perhaps, already planning their next move. The case had taken a terrifying turn. And one question remained unanswered. Was justice truly served, or was this just the beginning of something even more horrifying? Andrew's story serves as a harrowing reminder of the hidden dangers lurking in the world of online relationships. What began as an innocent search for love turned into a nightmare he never could have predicted. His tragic fate is not just a crime story, it's a warning. A warning to those who trust too easily, those who ignore the small inconsistencies, and those who believe that just because something feels real, it must be. Online dating has connected millions of people, but with every connection comes a risk. Behind a charming smile and affectionate words could be someone with dark intentions, someone who sees vulnerability as an opportunity. Andrew isn't the first victim of a romance scam turned deadly, and unless people start taking the right precautions, he won't be the last. So how can you protect yourself? Here are some critical safety tips to keep in mind. Never meet someone for the first time in a private or unfamiliar location. Always choose a busy, public place with security cameras and plenty of witnesses. Tell someone you trust about your plans. Share your location, the name of the person you're meeting, and updates throughout your time together. Be cautious of people who avoid video calls or refuse to meet in person for long periods. If someone is truly interested in you, they won't have excuses to hide their face. Watch for inconsistencies in their story. Scammers often forget details they've lied about. If something doesn't add up, don't ignore it. Never send money to someone you've never met. No matter how convincing their reasons may sound, this is one of the biggest red flags. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, don't brush it aside. Your gut feeling could be the only thing standing between you and danger. Andrew's story isn't just about a tragic ending. It's about the warning signs he missed, the dangers he never saw coming, and the choices that ultimately led him into the hands of a predator. If even one person learns from his mistake and avoids a similar fate, his story will not have been in vain. If this case shook you to your core, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you've ever had a strange or unsettling experience with online dating, share your story in the comments below. Your warning could save someone's life. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because next week, we uncover another real-life mystery, one that is even more chilling than this. Because in the world of crime, the next victim could be anyone. Stay safe. Stay vigilant. And remember, sometimes, love isn't what it seems.